Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we take stacks of complicated, often dense source material and give you the intellectual shortcut you need to be genuinely well-informed.
And today, we are undertaking a really critical deep dive. We're looking at a text that, while was published decades ago, remains profoundly controversial and, I'd say, foundational.
It really is. We're talking about the developmental psychology of the Black child, written by Amos N. back in 1978.
And this deep dive is just so necessary because Wilson's work doesn't just analyze. It's an attempt to completely restructure the frame through which we understand human development.
How so? What's the mission of the source material?
Well, his core mission is to address what he saw as a glaring inadequacy, an inherent bias, really in mainstream American psychology.
You mean developmental, educational, clinical psychology?
All of it, especially when discussing the Black child's experience. He insists that traditional psychology, by failing to account for sociocultural realities, has fundamentally misdiagnosed developmental differences.
Misdiagnose them as what?
As innate deficiencies.
Okay, let's unpack that central challenge immediately. If we're examining developmental psychology, we assume there's a standard of normal. What is that unquestioned norm that Wilson is challenging, and why does he find it so problematic?
The standard, historically and structurally, is the white middle-class child. It just is.
And what does that mean in practice?
It means this child growing up in a stable, resource-rich environment with access to specific cultural tools and very specific types of parental socialization. That child is established as the universal baseline.
The baseline for everything: maturity, intellect, emotional health.
Everything. So when researchers compare Black children to this very specific white standard, any deviation, behavioral, emotional, it gets automatically interpreted and labeled.
Labeled as a deficit, a failure.
Or proof of inherent inferiority. That's the core of his critique.
That's a powerful claim. But how carefully does Wilson navigate the risk here? Because reframing observed differences as, say, functional adaptations, couldn't critics interpret that as just confirming the differences exist rather than challenging the system that created them?
That's a great question, and he's very deliberate about it.
Yeah.
He argues that you have to divorce the outcome from the cause. His entire premise is that these developmental differences are overwhelmingly the result of environmental, economic, and political factors.
So the Black condition in America, as he puts it.
Exactly. The chronic, frustrating, and often traumatic realities of that condition. He's saying these are not inherent racial deficits. He is trying to shift the focus from what the child lacks to what the environment imposes on that child.
And the differences we see are logical responses to that imposition.
They're logical responses to systemic oppression, not innate failings. His argument is, if you don't acknowledge the environment, you basically default to a biological or genetic explanation. There's no other option.
That sets the stage for a very ambitious exploration. I mean, we aren't just looking at psychology here.
No, not at all. We're looking at sociology, economics, history, all woven together.
So for you, the learner, we've structured this deep dive systematically. We're going to trace development starting from the earliest stages, the prenatal period, and then move through infancy.
And after that, the formation of identity, which Wilson calls Black schizoid existence, a very provocative term we need to unpack.
We'll definitely get into that. Then we'll look at the fraught history of IQ testing, the crucial topic of language codes, and finally, motivational syndromes related to achievement.
It's a complete life cycle, but viewed through a culturally critical lens.
Let's start at the very beginning then. A period that the source material insists is absolutely foundational, the prenatal period.
Yes.
It's here, he argues, that systemic factors begin to lay the groundwork for physical and intellectual disadvantage before the child is even born. He's talking about pre-birth trauma.
This period is just so crucial for setting that physical and intellectual foundation. The health of the expectant mother, which is highly influenced by her socioeconomic environment and her access to care, that determines the child's initial biological endowment.
So the environment is acting on the mother, who then acts as a filter for the fetus.
Precisely. Wilson highlights repeatedly that the, quote, deprived conditions of Black existence severely impact the maternal prenatal environment. It reduces her ability to maintain optimal health, to get necessary nutrients, and that just sets up a whole trajectory of disadvantage.
The sources list a pretty broad spectrum of diseases and disorders that can affect the fetus. I mean, everything from infections like syphilis and rubella to chronic issues like heart disease and endocrine disorders.
Right, but the core link here isn't that these diseases are unique. It's the higher incidence and the higher severity of these problems among Black mothers compared to their white counterparts.
And that's simply because they are living under greater systemic stress and often lack adequate, consistent medical attention.
Yes. And this is reflected in some profoundly concerning data points regarding maternal health and mortality. This isn't just about, whether the mother or child survives birth. It's about the cumulative long-term effects of chronic stress.
Compounded by what? Poor diet.
Poor diet, inadequate medical access. It all leads to higher rates of prematurity and infant morbidity. The body of the mother becomes a filter, like you said, for socioeconomic disparity.
The source goes into some very specific risk factors, and the effects he describes are harrowing. One area that's emphasized is drug addiction. How does Wilson describe the biological consequence of habitual drug use during pregnancy?
He details that habitual drug use, particularly of opiates, by the expectant mother can, and I'm quoting here, virtually immobilize the brain of the fetus in utero.
Immobilize the brain, what does that even mean?
It affects the core structures of the central nervous system. So when the neonate is born to an addicted mother, they exhibit these severe disruptive withdrawal symptoms.
Like what, specific?
High rate, unusual crying, very disturbed sleep patterns, severe irritability, tremors, fever, and in the worst cases, even convulsions.
So these babies are in crisis from their first breath.
They are. They require intensive medical intervention, often lasting several days, just to stabilize their nervous systems.
Yeah.
And you have to think about what that disrupts. That fundamental earliest period of development that should be focused on bonding and maturation is instead a medical emergency.
Beyond drugs, the impact of malnutrition is clearly dissected, and he makes this important distinction between quantitative and qualitative malnutrition. For you listening, trying to grasp the technical side, what's the difference and why does it matter so much?
Okay, so quantitative malnutrition is the one we all think of first. It's a simple lack of sufficient calories, not enough food, period.
Starvation.
Essentially. But qualitative malnutrition is far more insidious. It's the lack of essential nutrients. We're talking proteins, vitamins, minerals that are absolutely crucial for fetal brain and body development. This can happen even if the mother feels full.
So she could be eating enough calories, but the wrong kinds of calories.
Exactly. And this distinction is vital because poor diets, even if they're calorically sufficient, can lead to chronic developmental failure. The building blocks for the brain just aren't there.
And the consequences of this nutritional deficit are severe, and the sources connect them directly to later performance in life.
Absolutely. We're talking about consequences that include mental retardation, poor intelligence test scores, reduced physical growth like smaller skulls and lower birth weight, and an increased vulnerability to disease throughout life.
The data point cited in the source regarding diet quality really brings this home.
It's a stark one. It states that in the U.S. at the time, only 37% of families with incomes under $3,000 had a good diet based on recommended allowances.
Let me repeat that. Only 37%. That means nearly two-thirds of the poorest families were deficient in the essential nutrients necessary for cognitive formation.
And you have to remember, this is during that rapid fetal brain development stage. The consequences of not having sufficient protein, iron, and key B vitamins during that window are, for all intents and purposes, irreversible.
So a faulty biological foundation is being laid.
A faulty biological foundation, a weak or damaged brain, is an environmental imposition. It fundamentally undermines all future physical and intellectual functioning, regardless of whatever genetic potential might have been there.
Let's unpack this further with the environmental context. The source uses some specific data comparing death rates, which really emphasizes how these socioeconomic conditions translate into literal life and death disparities.
Yes, we can look at the infant death rates per 1,000 live births in New York City during the mid-1960s. Wilson used this to show a shocking correlation between location, race, and income.
What did the numbers show?
In low-income districts like Central Harlem, the rate for what the data called Negro and Puerto Rican groups reached nearly 70 per 1,000 live births.
70 per 1,000. That is almost 1 in every 14 babies dying before their first birthday. That's just staggering. It speaks to an intense systemic pressure.
Now contrast that with high-income districts, like Tottenville on Staten Island, where the overall death rate was around 12 per 1,000.
12 versus 70?
The figures make it undeniable. These disparities are not simply racial characteristics. They are profound consequences of geopolitical, economic, and psychosocial environmental factors. Poor housing, inadequate diet, a chronic lack of prenatal medical care, and the sustained emotional stress of poverty. they all collectively elevate mortality rates.
So the statistics make it clear that the Black child is being born into the world with structural disadvantages already imprinted upon their physical body.
Yes, largely due to class-based barriers to survival. And Wilson even notes that the sheer trauma of living under these conditions, the overcrowding, poor sanitation, economic anxiety, all contributes to maternal emotional stress.
And that stress itself can harm the fetus.
The source suggests that this constant stress can affect the fetus's neuroendocrine system, sometimes causing developmental problems like a cleft palate or hair lip. So this early period truly establishes a physical handicap that can last a lifetime. It really sets the stage for everything that follows. Now, if we transition to the first 2 years of life, we hit a fascinating paradox. It's something that really challenges the simplicity of that deficiency narrative.
And what's that?
The early physical development of the Black infant often runs counter to what we see later in academic outcomes.
This is section 3, the first 2 years. And what you're saying is we find an initial physical acceleration that seems to contradict the later performance gaps we see in schools.
Exactly. Studies using accepted measures like the Gesell and Bailey scales consistently show that Black infants often achieve their psychomotor milestones.
Things like holding their head steady, sitting alone, standing, walking.
Right. They often achieve those several weeks or even months earlier than white infants. This initial acceleration appears to be a maturational or biological factor.
The source lists specific examples from these comparative studies. It says Black infants, on average, held their heads steady 6 weeks earlier than their European counterparts, sat alone 2 months earlier, and achieved standing and walking milestones significantly faster.
And this was noted widely by researchers at the time. They even drew connections to similar findings in infants from West African origins.
So this is a critical point for Wilson's argument.
It's critical because it indicates that initially there is no physical or biological handicap. In fact, there might be a physical advantage. But, and this is the key, the source is quick to point out that this early physical superiority is short-lived. The environmental factors, the socioeconomic and cultural stresses we just talked about, they quickly begin to dampen this acceleration after the first year of life.
And this transition period, around 15 to 24 months, that brings us to the critique of early cognitive assessment, specifically the reliability of infant intelligence tests.
Right. So if Black children are physically ahead, how do they fare on these initial mental assessments?
The IQ tests used for infants, like the Bailey scales, what do they measure?
They measure psychomotor development, but also mental scales. Things like object manipulation, imitation, early language behavior. And what's crucial here is the observation that Black children's scores on these tests are typically comparable to and sometimes even higher than those of white children.
But only for a short time.
Only during the first 15 months of life. Because up to that point, the tests are primarily measuring purely maturational biological functions.
What stands out to me is that the scores begin to diverge so significantly around 2 years of age, and then that academic gap just widens and widens. That sudden shift feels like the psychological tipping point.
This is where it gets really interesting for developmental theory. The source argues that the reliability and the predictive validity of IQ scores are very low in infancy, before the age of 2.
So they don't really tell you much about future intelligence.
Not really. And the fact that the scores diverge so dramatically after this initial, purely biological stage, it strongly suggests that the environment becomes the dominant force.
When you say environment, you mean psychosocial factors, cultural input.
Yes, the richness of language exposure, the educational setting, all of that becomes critically important in determining cognitive scores.
So the difference is not innate, it's learned, and it's culturally mediated. The intellectual functioning that will later be measured as intelligence is developed very clearly in the context of that environmental input.
Precisely. If the Black child is exposed to fewer complex symbolic stimuli, or receives less of the kind of feedback that promotes abstract reasoning because perhaps the parents are focused on concrete survival, their skill development is naturally going to lack.
And that's regardless of their initial physical capabilities.
Regardless, the Bailey findings, particularly concerning the mental scale, suggest that the differences we see after the second year are tied directly to the quality of the socioeconomic and cultural environment.
It's a powerful illustration of that environmental imposition we mentioned. Wilson is essentially arguing that the failure to achieve maximum intellectual potential is imposed by external circumstances that undermine that initial biological potential.
And that sharp shift in scores after 15 months. That marks the transition from purely physical maturation to psychosocial learning. It's the point where the harsh reality of the external environment begins to erode the child's initial advantage.
Okay, we move now to the central psychosocial theory of the source, and perhaps its most memorable concept, the schizoid nature of Black existence. This is where the emotional and identity toll of the environment is really defined and given its name.
This concept is absolutely essential for understanding the child's developing self-identity. It's closely related to W.E.B. Du Bois' concept of double consciousness.
So what does Wilson mean by it?
He defines the Black child as being born into a society where two separate, conflicting, and incompatible realities exist side by side.
Two worlds.
Two worlds. One is the Black world, their family, their culture, their community, which is consistently treated as inferior, flawed, and marginalized by the larger society.
And the other reality.
The other is the white dominant society, which represents the universal standard for success, for power, cultural validation, and material reward.
So about the term schizoid, it's very provocative.
It is, and he's careful to clarify, it's not a clinical psychiatric diagnosis of schizophrenia. He uses it to describe a chronic psychological state, a dual identity, where the person is torn between two opposing systems of values.
The conflict is profound then. The child is pressured to reject the Black world because society equates it with failure.
And at the same time, they're forced to accept the white world as the only path toward full psychological and material fulfillment.
That sounds like psychological chaos.
It creates exactly that. To survive, the child has to, in a sense, split their personality. They have to adopt behaviors and values that may directly contradict their family and community. This double consciousness leads to chronic self-rejection and a lifelong preoccupation with their own race relative to the white majority.
So it's an adaptive strategy that requires rejecting part of yourself to gain acceptance or success in the wider system.
It is. And tragically, this self-rejection is often reinforced by the community itself, which leads us to the painful topic of racial attitudes and physical characteristics.
You mean the beauty standards imposed by the dominant society bleeding into the Black community?
Yes, the standards of beauty and desirability within the Black community often reflect the dominant white aesthetic. This creates an internal hierarchy of worth based on things like skin color, facial features, and hair texture.
And the source cites studies on this.
It does. It references some painful research, like the Harrison and Ross study, which found that parents sometimes openly wish their child had lighter skin, or good hair, as they called it.
And those parental desires, whether they're expressed consciously or just, unconsciously absorbed, they communicate a negative social value, a judgment against the child's natural Black characteristics.
The child internalizes this judgment incredibly early. If a child believes their physical self is deemed less desirable or inferior by the world, and potentially by their own family, it leads directly to feelings of inadequacy, self-hatred, and mental despair.
So the parent's unconditional acceptance is a buffer against that.
It should be. Wilson notes that the emotional welfare of the child is heavily dependent on the parent's unconditional acceptance and love of the child's physical traits, regardless of outside societal judgments. But the stress of the environment often compromises the parent's own capacity to provide that.
Let's connect this intense identity conflict to parental functionality and the structure of the family. The source contrasts the socialization methods used by low-income Black mothers with those of middle-class mothers.
And this contrast demonstrates that environmental adaptation in real time. Lower-class Black mothers, he argues, often assume a highly disciplined, restrictive, directive, and controlling role.
Which might sound negative, but he sees it as functional.
It's primarily a functional adaptation to the harsh realities of their socioeconomic environment. The goal is survival. In an uncertain environment, dealing with neighborhood violence, police interaction, or economic instability, immediate obedience, external control, and adherence to rigid, concrete rules are necessary for the child's physical safety.
So the mother emphasizes control and concrete survival skills.
Sometimes at the expense of fostering exploration or abstract thought, yes.
Whereas the middle-class mother, operating in a more stable and protected environment, can socialize for different traits.
Right, she can socialize for independence, self-control, and deferred gratification traits that are necessary for long-term status achievement in the abstract, white-dominated professional world.
So one is training for survival in the ghetto, the other for success in the boardroom.
That's a good way to put it. The low-class mother is training the child for immediate safety and compliance within their environment, which is highly adaptive for that context. But Wilson argues this makes a child maladaptive for the abstract demands of the wider academic and professional world.
This dynamic really highlights how the environmental stress, the constant economic and emotional strain of the Black condition, directly impacts the family's ability to nurture the traits we traditionally associate with developmental success in Western society.
Exactly.
Here's where we see that Black schizoid existence manifest clearly in observable behavior. The preschool years and the early development of race awareness. This is a critical period, roughly ages 3 to 7, where children begin to internalize that social hierarchy.
And race awareness begins shockingly early. The source outlines 7 key consequences of the Black experience, which profoundly shape the child's concept of self and their relationship with the world.
So these points aren't just descriptions.
No, they articulate the resulting psychological injuries of that dual identity.
Rather than just listing all 7, let's maybe analyze the categories they fall into. They seem to cluster around themes of, say, cognitive acceptance of oppression and behavioral dependency.
That's a good framework. On the cognitive side, you see the internalization of racist propaganda. This leads to a belief in white superiority and the subsequent rejection of their own culture in favor of the symbols of the white culture they see as necessary for success.
That's the acceptance of the dominant narrative.
It is. And on the behavioral side,
What happens there?
this results in a profound functional dependency. The child develops what he calls a self-determination deficiency. They lack confidence, they feel powerless,
And this manifests
as a lack of practical self-confidence, requiring a kind of mental and physical dependency on the white majority for resources or direction. And ultimately, the cumulative emotional toll manifests as self-hatred, feelings of inferiority, and mental despair.
And sometimes that's expressed as a powerful desire to actually become white for practical purposes.
It is. And these are learned rational behavioral adaptations to a society that systematically denies rewards to Blackness. The child learns very early that the path to success and survival is tied to the standard of whiteness.
The most famous illustration of this internalization of inferiority is, of course, the Clark doll experiment. Let's detail the findings from the source, because they are perhaps the most historically resonant data point of this whole deep dive.
They really are. The 1950s study by Kenneth and Mamie Clark involved Black children aged 3 to 7. They were presented with identical black and white dolls and asked a series of questions about preference and identity.
And what were the core findings that Wilson relies on?
The source confirms the painful statistics. 60% to 70% of the Black children chose the white doll as the one they liked better, the nice doll, and the one they wanted to play with.
But the most psychologically devastating finding.
Was that a significant percentage, often incorrectly, identified the white doll as the one that looked like them?
I find that self-denial so striking. They're correctly identifying the negative social value assigned to Blackness, associating the Black doll with badness, but at the same time wishing to escape it, even at the cost of denying their own physical reality.
That's the moment the schizoid existence fully manifests. That preference for white identity, the desire to become white, is the profound early manifestation of that psychosocial conflict.
So the internalization of negative social values is already powerfully affecting their self-concept and emotional health, even before they start school.
Yes. Wilson views this as symptomatic of deep-seated confusion, anxiety, and the beginnings of identity fragmentation regarding race.
And to reinforce this, the source contrasts the Clark findings with Goodman's study on in-group, out-group orientation among Black and white children, also in that preschool age range.
Goodman's tabular data is exceptionally revealing. It gives us a stark comparison of the foundational sense of self in these kids. So when comparing preschool-age children, white children showed a 92% in-group affinity, a very strong positive preference for their own group.
And Black children.
Black children, however, only showed 28% in-group affinity.
92% loyalty versus 28%. That difference is the operational definition of systemic psychological damage.
And it gets worse when we look at inferiority. 0%, exactly 0% of white children reported feelings of inferiority toward the outgroup, the Black children.
And for Black children.
A staggering 57% of Black children reported feelings of inferiority toward the outgroup, the white children.
That quantitative difference is it's stark. White children already possess a strong sense of group loyalty and superiority, while the majority of Black children have already adopted an orientation of inferiority and low group loyalty. It's truly shocking that this psychological template is set so young.
But he would say it is an adaptive orientation. The black child has learned to reject the black world because it does not provide the rewards, status, or power necessary for success, and they adopt the white world as the symbol of achievement.
And this orientation, this behavioral profile, marked by low self-confidence and high dependency.
That is what is programmed into the child by the socioeconomic and political environment. This early orientation is highly detrimental to long-term emotional and intellectual development, leading to a predisposition towards self-sabotage in future efforts to achieve success.
Transitioning from emotional development to intellectual assessment, we have to confront the long shadow of standardized testing, the intelligence controversy, and the historical use of standardized IQ tests.
This section is critical because Wilson provides a powerful argument against the test's perceived objectivity. He argues very clearly that standard IQ tests do not measure inherent intellectual capacity.
So what do they measure?
They measure learned achievement, specifically learned achievements tied to cultural values, vocabulary, verbal skills, and the specific cognitive style of the white middle class.
So IQ, which is derived by dividing mental age by chronological age, is fundamentally a measure of the child's development relative to the normative standards of the group from which the test was extracted.
Exactly. If the norm is middle class, the test is culturally loaded and biased against any other group.
How so?
Well, the test demands specific cultural knowledge, a specific vocabulary, a specific pace of response that is often foreign or irrelevant to many low-income black children.
And this cultural bias is reflected in the scores.
It's reflected in that well-documented difference. Black children score, on average, 12 to 15 points lower than white children. And Wilson uses specific data, like the McMemor study, to show that this gap holds even when you stratify by social class.
Right. The McMemor data is often cited in these debates. It stratifies by social class groups, often labeled things like superior family status, average, below average, to see if class alone accounts for the difference. And what did it reveal? It
revealed that the scoring differences are closely tied to socioeconomic factors within the racial groups, but the overall racial gap persists. For instance, the highest scoring black groups sometimes score lower than the lowest scoring white groups.
Do you have the specific data?
The data cited in the source shows that the superior family status white mean IQ was 97.24, while the superior family status black mean IQ was 91.24. This confirms the critical role of environment, resources, and cultural milieu, which goes beyond just a simple economic indicator.
The most compelling evidence Wilson cites to support this environmental hypothesis comes from the adoption studies. I'm thinking of researchers like Skar-Salapatek and Weinberg. This must have fundamentally challenged the genetic arguments that were so prevalent in 1978.
It did, absolutely. These studies examined black children who were adopted in early infancy by white middle-class families. The goal was to isolate the variable of environment from genetics as cleanly as possible.
And what were their findings?
The findings were bombshell at the time. These black children raised from early infancy in white middle-class environments, with all the specific educational stimulation, language exposure, and resources that entails, they scored an average IQ of 110.
110. That's significantly higher than the national average for black children, which is around 90.
It's even slightly above the general white average. This result just powerfully undercuts the genetic argument and reinforces Wilson's central thesis. Environment, socialization, resources, and cultural support are the most important factors determining these test scores.
This moves us seamlessly into a discussion of cognitive styles, particularly the distinction between concrete and abstract thinking. This is where that environmental adaptation truly reveals itself.
Yes. The source identifies two primary cognitive styles, citing a researcher named Drucker, which are strongly correlated with social class and environment.
Let's start with the first one.
Concrete thinking. This is associated with lower class and black children. This style focuses on sensory motor qualities, practical, tangible reality, and immediate specific details. It's very context-bound and pragmatic, driven by necessity.
And the other style, abstract conceptual thinking.
That is the style valued by the school system. It's associated with middle-class and white children. This style deals with relationships, symbols, generalizations, and theoretical concepts. It's context-independent and universalistic. It allows for hypothetical thought and planning for the distant future.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, the low-class child is essentially forced into a concrete, survival-based thinking pattern.
They are. Survival in the ghetto demands an immediate, present-focused mentality dealing with things and immediate, tangible realities. This is highly adaptive for that specific environment.
But maladaptive for school.
That is the core takeaway. This concrete, survival-based orientation is perfectly functional in their world. It helps them navigate immediate dangers and necessities. But it is fundamentally maladaptive in the abstract, symbol-focused, and concept-driven world of the middle-class classroom.
Because the school demands abstract thought.
And an elaborated code, which we'll get to. The concretely oriented black child is penalized. The IQ test measures a specific kind of adaptation, and the adaptation required for survival outside the classroom handicaps them inside the classroom.
Let's turn our attention to the tool of thought itself, language and communication. The source makes a powerful case that language is both a tool for socialization and a profound reflection of social structure and cultural heritage.
Absolutely. The way a child learns language really dictates how they perceive, think, and feel. Wilson immediately affirms that Black English, BE, or what we now often call African American Vernacular English, is a complex, rule-governed linguistic system.
It's not just bad or deficient Standard English.
Not at all. It is the mother tongue for many Black children, and it's rooted in historical and sociocultural separation and adaptation.
The source uses the Barat study to provide specific, crucial examples of how BE functions as its own sophisticated linguistic system. We should probably elaborate on these structural differences because they're the root of so much miscommunication and educational penalization in the classroom.
We must highlight them. They demonstrate that BE operates under its own consistent, predictable set of rules. For example, in possessive markers, Standard English requires the sets, right? John's cousin. BE often uses a zero marker. John cousin.
The meaning is preserved, but the structure is different.
Exactly. And what about verb forms? This is one that often trips up teachers who mistake it for an error.
What's the difference there?
In Standard English, you have the third-person singular marker. John lives in New York.
Yeah.
In BE, it's often a zero marker, reflecting the history of the language structure. John lives in New York.
And there's also the zero copula.
Yes, the omission of the verb to be, is, or are, when it functions as a linking verb. So, he running instead of he is running. The unmarked plural is another feature, where the plural marker is often omitted if the quantity is already implied.
The studies cited in the source confirm these are consistent internalized rules.
They do. White children trying to repeat sentences in BE often err towards Standard English, and Black children repeating Standard English sentences often err toward PE. They're adhering to two distinct internalized linguistic structures.
And this leads us directly to the critical application of Bernstein's code theory and its implications for social class and intellectual success.
Yes, because the type of language you speak fundamentally dictates your cognitive style.
Okay, let's unpack Bernstein's codes thoroughly. The restricted code and the elaborated code. Let's start with the code Wilson links to the low-income Black community.
The restricted code is typically associated with the lower social class. It's characterized by simple, short, often grammatically condensed sentences. It relies heavily on nonverbal cues and is highly context-bound.
What does context-bound mean?
It means the listener has to already know the context, the shared history, or be in the physical environment to fully understand the meaning. It's particularistic. It deals with immediate, specific, and tangible experiences.
And Wilson argues this code reflects a certain kind of social structure.
A mechanical, rigid social structure. It's often necessary in high-density communities where group identity and immediate efficient command are paramount for safety.
So if someone using a restricted code said, he put the thing there, they're relying on the listener to see what thing they mean and to know what there refers to. It's effective within the group, but useless outside of it.
Exactly. The restricted code assumes shared knowledge and history. Now contrast that with the elaborated code.
Which is the code of the middle class.
The code of the middle class of primarily white society, and it is the language of academia. It uses complex grammar, subordinate clauses, a precise vocabulary, and is critically context independent.
So you don't need to be there to understand it.
Right. It allows for the expression of abstract, universalistic concepts and complex relationships without relying on a shared, immediate context.
The impact on the Black child, then, is clear. They're socialized in the restricted code, which is functional within their community, but it's inherently inadequate for the conceptual and linguistic demands of the middle-class classroom.
Yes. School operates almost exclusively in the elaborated code. This mismatch immediately places the child at a severe disadvantage, and this manifests as those low IQ scores.
So abstract thinking, the ability to generalize, conceptual reasoning, all the things needed for school.
They are intrinsically linked to that elaborated linguistic code. Wilson asserts that the child's language structure shapes their entire cognitive structure. If the language is restricted, the conceptual range may also be restricted. They literally lack the words and the sentence structures to manipulate abstract concepts easily.
This raises an important question then. Should Black English be eradicated, given the academic disadvantage?
The source explicitly states that Black English should never be deemed bad or inferior. It's a complex, functional linguistic system that holds cultural validity.
So what's the solution?
He advocates that for the Black child to function effectively in the dominant society and achieve economic mobility, they must be taught standard English as a second language. The goal is bicultural, bilingual competence.
So you provide them with the elaborated code, the symbolic tools they need for success without destroying the cultural validity or self-identity that's rooted in their mother tongue.
Exactly.
Moving to our penultimate section, we examine the culmination of all these environmental and cultural factors in socialization, achievement, and cultural determinism. How does this external reality affect a person's internal motivation?
We return once more to that distinction in parental function. As we noted, middle-class parents socialize for characteristics crucial for high status: self-control, independence, deferred gratification.
And lower-class Black parents, due to that chronic socioeconomic frustration, socialize for obedience and immediate external control, prioritizing survival.
And this difference in function creates distinct, measurable motivational patterns that profoundly affect academic performance.
The source outlines a powerful model of motivational syndromes that result from poverty and powerlessness, a model Wilson adapted from Purcell. This model describes the behavioral patterns adapted by lower-class individuals facing systemic barriers.
This is where adaptation becomes tragically maladaptive in the context of mainstream achievement.
What's the central mechanism?
The central mechanism is this. Poverty leads directly to powerlessness, the sense that you have no control over external rewards or punishments. If you believe the system is rigged, then your own effort feels meaningless.
And this results in key behavioral syndromes that are adaptive responses to a hostile environment.
Yes, let's break them down.
Okay, let's start with low achievement motivation.
This is a lack of incentive to strive for goals. Why try hard in school or strive for a high-status career when history and current systemic realities show that your effort is often blocked by discriminatory barriers? The incentive structure is broken.
So the effort required is just too high for the potential payoff you might receive.
Exactly. This leads to a general absence of the motivation necessary for high academic performance.
The second is the inability to delay gratification. This is a classic sociological indicator of lower social class, but Wilson views it differently.
He views it as rational behavior. The lack of control over the future, coupled with immediate needs for survival like needing money for rent or food, now makes the individual choose immediate, smaller rewards over larger future rewards.
It's not about a lack of discipline, it's about uncertainty.
Why defer pleasure or resources when external forces like an eviction or a sudden illness might take away those future rewards anyway? The future is too uncertain to trust. Immediate pleasure or survival has to be prioritized.
Third on the list is apathy.
This is a general lack of deep interest in development, personal well-being, or the future. It often manifests as fatalism, the belief that growth and development is simply a matter of fate or chance.
This sounds like learned helplessness.
It's a form of it. If you feel powerless, you stop investing emotional energy into things you cannot control. It's an emotional defense mechanism against repeated failure and humiliation imposed by the system.
And perhaps most critically for psychological study and achievement, the development of an external locus of control.
This is a core finding. An external locus of control is the belief that rewards or punishments are due to luck, chance, or powerful external forces, the white man, the system, fate, rather than your own personal effort or competence.
And that's a highly functional response to a discriminatory environment where hard work frequently goes unrewarded or is actively sabotaged.
It is. But that external locus of control fundamentally undermines the effort required for high achievement in school. If you believe success is random or determined by forces outside of your control, why bother trying to study harder or be more independent? You might as well just try your luck.
And the problem is compounded by the function of school and achievement.
Yes, because schools are fundamentally middle-class institutions that reinforce middle-class values. They demand the elaborated code, abstract thinking, and an internal locus of control, the belief that you control your destiny.
But the black child enters the school system with a restricted code, concrete thinking, and an external locus of control.
Precisely the opposite of what the institution rewards.
The source points out that schools fail by not providing relevant motivational rewards for these children, nor do they sufficiently acknowledge the existing cultural knowledge or cognitive style they bring from home.
They try to remediate a perceived deficiency, but they fail to recognize the functionality of the existing adaptation. They're trying to treat a symptom without treating the disease, and the disease is the socioeconomic reality.
This brings us back to the overarching concept, cultural determinism.
Yes. Wilson emphasizes that cultural heritage shapes an individual's entire existence, their perception, their thoughts, their feelings. The individual's personality is shaped by the total system of beliefs, values, and cognitive structures of their cultural group.
And what does Wilson call the resultant cultural heritage of the Black community in America? The template that dictates behavior.
He called it Black mythology.
Hmm.
This is the total system of beliefs, values, and cognitive structures developed by Black people as an adaptive, functional response to the unique American socio-political environment.
So it's a survival narrative.
It's a necessary survival narrative.
Yeah.
This mythology provides the template for perception and behavior, reflecting the history of slavery, oppression, and systemic barriers. And the source stresses that a necessary cultural revolution must occur within the Black community to cultivate positive values and symbols that promote self-love, self-confidence, and achievement, rather than the dependency and inferiority reinforced by the dominant system.
So it's an internal revolution to build a positive self-identity that is independent of the white standard.
That's the core of his prescription.
We've traced the development of the Black child from the foundation of prenatal health disparities, through the paradox of early physical development, into the damaging psychological conflict of the schizoid existence, and finally explored how biased intellectual assessment and linguistic codes reinforce that cycle of environmental disadvantage.
And the core message running throughout the developmental psychology of the Black child is utterly consistent. The developmental issues observed are not signs of inherent inferiority. They are logical, functional, and sometimes tragically maladaptive responses to chronic political, economic, and social frustration.
So the low achievement, the apathy, the external locus of control.
These are symptoms of a hostile environment that prioritizes immediate survival over long-term abstract success.
Wilson's source material consistently places the burden of change on two critical integrated fronts.
Yes. On the one hand, external political and economic barriers must be dismantled, eliminating the enforcement of inferiority through housing discrimination, unequal employment, and biased education.
But crucially,
The source insists that the primary responsibility for solving Black developmental issues lies with the Black family and community.
what does that mean in practice?
It means teaching culturally relevant skills, challenging negative self-concepts, and actively building a self-affirming Black mythology to promote self-love and self-reliance, rather than reinforcing dependency on white standards. The community must provide its own positive images and symbols that promote achievement and foster an internal locus of control.
So it's a call to understand the mechanisms of oppression in developmental terms so that the response can be psychological and cultural, not just politically activist. The child needs the tools to successfully negotiate both the Black world and the white world.
Absolutely. The need is for a bicultural, bilingual competence. This means mastering the elaborated code and abstract cognitive styles to function effectively in the dominant society, while simultaneously cultivating an identity and self-concept rooted in self-love and confidence in their own cultural validity.
He argues it's the only viable path forward to psychological wholeness. That brings us to our final thought for you, the listener. The source emphasizes that the Black child develops a worldview mythology, a system of beliefs and values that is a functional response to racial conflict and socioeconomic stress. Wilson argues that this mythology profoundly affects language, cognition, and motivation, shaping the entire individual.
So if cultural heritage is that powerful, if it dictates what you perceive, what you value, and how you think, consider this. We spent this deep dive analyzing how the Black child's view of normal development is shaped by the unexamined myths of the dominant society.
So the final thought is,
How much of your own seemingly objective knowledge about society, about success, about intelligence, and even about what constitutes normal development is actually rooted in the unexamined cultural and social myths of your own background? What are the unstated rules governing your thoughts, and who set the standard for your perception of reality?